Between 1853 and 1854, along the Ogeechee River corridor in southeastern Georgia, 9 white overseers disappeared from plantations. The vanishings were never reported by local newspapers. Each man was listed in county records as simply relocated or moved west. But a different truth was told in whispered stories within the slave quarters of Burke County. Stories of a pale figure moving through the darkness, of screams echoing from the cypress groves, and of skin discovered stretched and curing like leather in hidden places deep within the swamps. They called him Devil's White, the enslaved population did, and they spoke his name only in the quietest moments when overseers were far from earshot. These men simply left Georgia for opportunities elsewhere, claimed the official records. The enslaved people who lived through those 18 months knew better. Before we continue with the terror that gripped the plantations of Burke County and the story of Devil's White, I need to ask you something important. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. We want to know where our audience is discovering these forgotten American horrors. Now, let's return to the nightmare beginning in the autumn of 1853. In the early 1850s, Burke County, Georgia, was a landscape of brutal contradictions. Dense forests of cypress and tupelo were carved through by the Ogeechee River, creating a maze of swamps and tributaries that planters had learned to harness for rice cultivation. The county sat in the heart of Georgia's Black Belt, where in some districts, enslaved people outnumbered white residents by margins of 10-1. The uplands were ruled by cotton, the swamps were dominated by rice, and human bondage made both possible. Across 3,000 acres of this unforgiving terrain stretched the Calhoun Plantation. From his father in 1847, Jeremiah Calhoun had inherited the property along with 237 enslaved people whose names appeared in his ledgers as mere livestock entries. Preferring his townhouse in Savannah, where he could maintain the social standing expected of Georgia's planter class and conduct business, Calhoun himself rarely visited the property. The actual management of his property fell to a succession of overseers, white men typically drawn from the poor farming class who saw the position as their one opportunity to exercise power over others. Killing work was the work on the Calhoun Plantation. Rice cultivation required enslaved people to stand in water up to their waists for hours, their legs swelling from constant immersion, their hands bleeding from handling the sharp stalks. With such regularity did dysentery, cholera, and malaria sweep through the slave quarters that Calhoun budgeted for the annual loss of human property the way other planters budgeted for equipment replacement. Regardless of human cost, the overseers who managed this nightmare were expected to extract maximum productivity, and they were given absolute authority to achieve that goal through any means they deemed necessary. Under unusual circumstances in October of 1853, an enslaved man arrived at the Calhoun Plantation. The county records list him only as property transfer, male, 28, albino, field hand, origin, Chatham County. He had no recorded name in any official document. Though whether this was a name he chose or one given to him remains unknown, the enslaved community would come to call him Silas. His appearance was what made Silas remarkable and what would ultimately make him legendary. Complete albinism was rare among any population, but among enslaved Africans, it created a particularly cruel set of circumstances. Silas's skin held no melanin whatsoever. It was pale as candle wax, prone to blistering and burning under the Georgia sun. His eyes were a washed-out blue that watered constantly in daylight, forcing him to squint against illumination that other workers tolerated easily. Fine and white grew his hair, nothing like the coarse dark hair typical of his people. Throughout his life, this appearance had marked him as cursed or touched by something unnatural in the eyes of both enslaved and enslaver populations. The records from Chatham County that accompanied his transfer were sparse but revealing. In the previous 6 years, Silas had been sold 4 times, always after incidents the records described only as * difficulties with management * or * unsuitability for cooperative labor *. More specific was one notation from 1851. * subject displays extreme resistance to correction. Previous owner reports 2 overseers injured during discipline attempts. Recommends sale to interior plantation where isolation can be maintained. * throughout Burke County, a man whose reputation preceded him was Thomas Greer, the head overseer at the Calhoun Plantation. At 43 years old, he had spent 2 decades managing enslaved labor across Georgia and South Carolina. He was known for what the planter class euphemistically called *firm management*, a term that concealed regular beatings, torture of those who worked too slowly, and sexual violence against enslaved women that produced a generation of mixed-race children he never acknowledged. Near the main plantation buildings, Grier lived in a house, a structure far superior to the slave quarters but still modest compared to the main house that Jeremiah Calhoun occupied during his infrequent visits. To help manage the plantation's operations, Grier employed 8 assistant overseers. These men came from similar backgrounds to Grier himself, poor whites who had grown up farming small plots. Men who saw overseeing as their opportunity to rise above the poverty they'd been born into. They ranged in age from 22 to 51. And they shared a worldview shaped by the brutal social hierarchies of the antebellum South. They understood that their position depended on maintaining absolute control over the enslaved population, and they enforced that control through calculated violence. With immediate derision, the assistant overseers responded to his appearance when Silas arrived at the Calhoun plantation in late October. A man named Wade Parsons declared that Silas looked like something that crawled out of hell wearing the wrong skin. Another, Robert Finch, suggested that his pale appearance made him touched by the devil and predicted he wouldn't last a month in the rice fields. With mixed reactions, the enslaved population observed Silas. Some viewed his condition with superstitious fear, others with the weary sympathy of people who understood what it meant to be marked as different in a world that punished difference without mercy. To the rice fields, the most physically demanding and dangerous work on the plantation, Thomas Grier assigned Silas. The rice grew in fields that had been cleared from swampland, creating paddies that had to be flooded and drained according to the crop's growth cycle. Enslaved workers spent their days bent over in ankle-deep to waist-deep water, planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting rice under a sun that turned the landscape into a steam bath by midday. Particularly brutal was this assignment for someone with Silas's condition. His skin, unable to produce protective melanin, burned and blistered within hours of sun exposure. The constant water immersion caused his skin to crack and peel, creating wounds that refused to heal in the humid environment. With satisfaction rather than concern, Grier watched Silas's suffering. In his view, the albino slave's pain was justice for whatever defiance had led to his multiple sales. Grier responded with the whip when Silas worked more slowly than other enslaved people, struggling with vision problems and physical pain. During Silas's 3rd day at the plantation occurred the first beating, when he failed to complete his assigned section of the rice field before sunset. Grier had him tied to a post near the slave quarters and delivered 20 lashes while the other enslaved workers were forced to watch, a standard technique meant to reinforce the consequences of inadequate productivity. Something that should have warned him was what Grier noticed during that first beating. No sound did Silas make. Most people being whipped screamed, begged, or at least grunted with each strike. Silas remained silent, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Grier's shoulder. When it was finished and he was cut down, Silas walked back to his quarters without limping or showing any sign of pain, though his back was striped with bleeding welts. About this afterward whispered the other enslaved people, noting that someone who could endure such punishment without crying out was someone to watch carefully. Through November and into December of 1853 continued the routine of plantation life. The weather turned colder, which brought some relief to Silas's sun-damaged skin but introduced new miseries in the form of freezing water in the rice paddies. Before dawn began the workday and continued until after sunset with only brief breaks for meals of cornmeal and whatever vegetables the enslaved people could grow in their small garden plots. Through constant surveillance and random violence, the overseers maintained control, ensuring that fear remained the dominant emotional reality for the enslaved population. During these weeks, several enslaved people noticed that Silas disappeared sometimes during the brief hours between the end of work and the required return to quarters. No one knew where he went, though some reported seeing his pale figure moving toward the cypress groves that bordered the plantation's rice fields. Dangerous territory were these groves, dense, swampy areas filled with cottonmouth snakes and alligators, places where even experienced woodsmen could become disoriented and lost. That Silas ventured into these areas alone and always returned suggested either recklessness or an intimate knowledge of swamp navigation that seemed impossible for someone who had only recently arrived at the plantation. A brief respite from labor was brought by Christmas week, a tradition that most planters observed to maintain the illusion of paternalistic benevolence. The enslaved people received slightly better rations, a few hours of permitted celebration, and a temporary reduction in supervision. It was during this period that an enslaved woman named Delilah had a conversation with Silas that she would remember for the rest of her life. Delilah was 52 years old, a cook who worked in the plantation's main kitchen and had survived 3 decades of bondage through careful observation and strategic silence. She found Silas sitting alone near the quarters, his pale skin stark against the darkness. "They say you've been sold 4 times before coming here," Delilah said, settling herself on the ground near him. "They say you got troubles with overseers wherever you go." Immediately didn't respond Silas. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "Troubles find me. I don't go looking for them." "That man, Greer," Delilah continued. "He's the worst kind. He'll kill you slow if you give him reason. I seen him do it before. There was a man 3 years back, field hand named Joseph, who talked back once. Greer had him beaten so bad he died 2 days later. Didn't matter to Mr. Calhoun. He just bought another slave to replace him." "I know what Greer is," Silas said. His pale eyes caught the moonlight, giving them an eerie, reflective quality. "I know what all of them are." "And then you best keep your head down," Delilah advised. "Whatever you thinking about doing, whatever anger you carrying, you got to bury it deep. Anger gets us killed." For the first time, Silas turned to look at her fully. Maybe anger is the only thing that keeps us alive. The conversation ended there, but Delilah would later testify that she felt a chill run through her body as he spoke those words, a sensation she couldn't explain but couldn't shake. On January 7, 1854, occurred the first disappearance. Failed to appear for the morning assembly of enslaved workers did Wade Parsons, one of the assistant overseers. This was unusual because Parsons was known for his punctuality and his enthusiasm for the first beating of the day, which he considered essential for establishing the proper tone of fear and submission. When Parsons didn't appear by mid-morning, Thomas Greer sent another overseer, a man named Benjamin Strickland, to check Parsons's cabin. Strickland found the cabin empty. The bed was unmade, and Parsons's coat still hung on its peg near the door, suggesting he hadn't planned to go far. His rifle, which he normally carried everywhere, leaned against the wall. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the food cold and untouched for hours. Nothing suggested violence or struggle. Parsons simply wasn't there. A search party that included 3 other overseers and a group of enslaved men he considered trustworthy enough to assist without attempting escape was organized by Greer. They combed the plantation grounds, the nearby woods, and the swamp edges. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of an accident. As thoroughly as if he had never existed had Wade Parsons simply vanished. The disappearance troubled Greer because it represented a loss of control. In the social order of the plantation, white overseers occupied a position of absolute authority. The idea that one could simply disappear suggested a breakdown in that order, a crack in the facade of invulnerability that maintained the entire system. A message to Jeremiah Calhoun in Savannah was sent by Greer, reporting Parsons's absence and speculating that the man might have gotten drunk and wandered off, possibly falling into the river or becoming lost in the swamps. With carefully concealed satisfaction, the enslaved population responded to Parsons's disappearance. Parsons had been particularly cruel, known for whipping enslaved people for the smallest infractions and for targeting young women with sexual violence. His absence was a blessing, though no one dared speak this thought aloud. What they did whisper about in the quiet hours after the overseers had retired was the fact that Silas had been working in a rice field within sight of Parsons's last known location, and that several people had seen Parsons yelling at Silas the afternoon before his disappearance. 3 weeks passed. The rhythm of plantation life continued with one fewer overseer, a situation that increased the workload on the remaining white men but didn't fundamentally alter the brutal reality of enslaved existence. A replacement was hired by Greer, a young man named Daniel Carmichael, who came from a farming family in Greene County and was eager to prove himself capable of managing enslaved labor. On February 3, disappeared Daniel Carmichael. So closely did the circumstances mirror Parsons's vanishing that Greer felt genuine alarm for the first time. Carmichael had been supervising work in the rice fields during the afternoon. When the enslaved workers were called back to quarters at sunset, Carmichael wasn't with them. A search of his cabin revealed the same details as Parsons's disappearance: a half-eaten meal, personal belongings undisturbed, no signs of violence or struggle. It was as if Carmichael had simply stopped existing mid-thought. This time, Greer expanded the search. He brought in men from neighboring plantations, experienced trackers who knew the swamps and forests. They found nothing. The slave patrols that regularly roamed the county roads were notified to watch for any suspicious activity. County authorities were quietly informed, though no official report was filed. Planters preferred to handle such matters privately to avoid any appearance of vulnerability in their control over enslaved populations. Like humidity before a storm hung the tension created by the disappearances over the Calhoun plantation. The remaining overseers began traveling in pairs, unwilling to be alone in areas where enslaved workers were present. They carried their weapons constantly and watched the enslaved population with increased suspicion. Increased as the overseers attempted to reassert control through intensified violence did random beatings. With the grim resignation of people who understood that their survival depended on appearing compliant while revealing nothing, did the enslaved people endure this escalation. With the same silent intensity he had displayed since arriving at the plantation, continued Silas his work in the rice fields. His skin bore the scars of constant sun damage and frequent beatings, creating a pattern of pale scar tissue over pink burns that gave him an even more unsettling appearance. Began to avoid him did the other enslaved workers, not out of dislike, but out of fear that association with him might draw the overseer's suspicion. Something about Silas made people uncomfortable: a stillness in his manner, a complete absence of the fear that governed everyone else's behavior. On the same night, March 19, disappeared two overseers. Robert Finch and a man named George Talbot had been assigned to night watch duty, a rotation that Greer had implemented after Carmichael's disappearance. They were supposed to patrol the area around the slave quarters and the main plantation buildings, watching for any suspicious activity. When morning came, both men were gone. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree at the edge of the cypress grove, positioned carefully as if someone had placed them there deliberately. Nothing but dense vegetation and dark water was revealed by a search of the grove itself. The depth of his alarm was revealed by Thomas Greer's response to the third and fourth disappearances. He sent an urgent message to Jeremiah Calhoun demanding that the owner return to the plantation immediately, describing the situation as critical and requiring direct intervention. While waiting for Calhoun's arrival, Greer implemented a series of measures designed to prevent further disappearances and to uncover whoever or whatever was responsible. From sunset to sunrise were all enslaved people confined to their quarters with armed guards posted at every entrance. Without warning would anyone leaving the quarters for any reason be shot. In groups of 3 or more worked the overseers, never alone, and maintained constant visual contact with each other. Dozens of enslaved people were personally interrogated by Greer, using torture when he deemed it necessary, trying to extract information about who might be responsible for the disappearances. Nothing useful was revealed by these interrogations. Either the enslaved population genuinely knew nothing, or their silence was impenetrable. Began to take notice of the situation did the white community of Burke County, though the full extent of the disappearances remained concealed. Planters discussed the matter quietly at social gatherings, speculating about runaway slaves turned violent or possible outside interference from abolitionists. A nightmare scenario for Georgia's planter class in 1854 was the presence of active resistance to slavery. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia remained vivid even 23 years after it occurred, a reminder that the enslaved population could and would fight back if given opportunity and leadership. That the disappearances might be related to the tensions that were building across the South over the question of slavery's expansion was suggested by some planters. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed just weeks before the first disappearance on the Calhoun plantation, had inflamed sectional tensions and prompted increased abolitionist activity. There were rumors of underground railroad networks extending deeper into Georgia than previously thought, and of northern agitators working to incite slave rebellions. Why the disappeared men left no trace failed to explain these theories, but they provided a framework for understanding the situation that didn't require planters to confront the more disturbing possibility that someone or something was hunting white overseers with complete impunity. On March 25 arrived Jeremiah Calhoun at his plantation, accompanied by his personal secretary and 2 hired guards. Calhoun was a thin man of 56, dressed in the fine clothing that marked his social standing, visibly uncomfortable in the rural setting of his own property. Wealth and enslaved people he had inherited, but he had never developed the stomach for the actual mechanics of plantation management. That distaste had led him to rely entirely on overseers like Greer, allowing them free rein to manage his human property however they saw fit. In the plantation's main house, a substantial structure that had been built by Calhoun's father in the 1820s, took place the meeting between Calhoun and Greer. With military precision laid out Greer the facts of the disappearances, dates, locations, circumstances, and the complete absence of evidence or witnesses. He also shared his growing conviction that someone among the enslaved population was responsible, though he admitted he had no proof and no suspects. "I've managed enslaved people for 20 years, Greer told Calhoun. "I know when they're planning something. There's a feeling in the air, a tension you can sense. But this is different. They're scared. Truly scared, but not of us. They're scared of something else." Bringing in the county sheriff and organizing an official investigation was suggested by Calhoun. But this idea was immediately opposed by Greer. An official investigation would create a public record of the plantation's inability to maintain order, potentially devaluing Calhoun's property and creating legal complications. Partly through the illusion of complete control did the planter class maintain its authority. Admitting that 4 white men had disappeared without explanation would shatter that illusion. Instead, they agreed on a different approach. Additional overseers from outside Burke County would be hired by Greer, men who wouldn't be aware of the previous disappearances and who could provide fresh eyes on the situation. They would also implement a reward system, offering freedom to any enslaved person who provided information leading to the capture of whoever was responsible for the disappearances. This latter strategy was calculated to divide the enslaved population, turning them against each other in the hope that someone would betray useful information. In early April arrived the new overseers. 3 men recruited from rice plantations in South Carolina, all experienced in managing enslaved labor under harsh conditions. Their names were Marcus Sloan, Raymond Dodd, and Henry Fletcher. Greer briefed them on the plantation's operations but deliberately omitted any mention of the disappearances, telling them only that the plantation had recently experienced management turnover and required additional supervision. For 2 weeks, occurred nothing unusual. The presence of new overseers and the increased security measures seemed to have stabilized the situation. Began to relax slightly did Greer, believing that the disappearances might have been the work of an outsider who had been frightened off by the enhanced security. Prepared to return to Savannah did Calhoun, satisfied that his property was now under proper control. On April 22, didn't return from the morning inspection of the rice fields did Marcus Sloan. Among the remaining overseers triggered panic the discovery of Sloan's disappearance. The pattern was breaking. During daylight hours while enslaved workers were present and under supervision had Sloan disappeared. This suggested a boldness that made the previous disappearances seem almost cautious by comparison. Immediately ordered a lockdown of the entire plantation did Greer. All work stopped. Under armed guard was every enslaved person confined to the quarters. The remaining overseers, along with Calhoun's hired guards, conducted a systematic search of every structure and area on the plantation grounds. This time they found something. In the cypress grove, approximately half a mile from the rice fields where Sloan had been working, discovered searchers a clearing that showed signs of recent disturbance. The ground had been torn up in places, and there were marks in the soft earth that might have been drag marks, though the swampy conditions made precise interpretation impossible. More disturbing were the marks on several cypress trees. Deep gouges in the bark, as if something had been scraped against the wood with considerable force. Some of the gouges showed traces of what appeared to be blood, though the amount was minimal, and the condition made testing impossible. The search expanded to cover the entire cypress grove and the swamp areas beyond was ordered by Greer. This proved difficult. The terrain was treacherous with hidden sinkholes, dense vegetation, and water that could reach waist-deep without warning. The searchers worked in groups, calling out to each other constantly to maintain contact. They found nothing else of significance. If Sloane had met his fate in that clearing, his body had been moved or hidden with remarkable effectiveness. Again was interrogated the enslaved population, this time with increased violence. Greer's restraint, such as it was, had eroded completely. He personally oversaw torture sessions designed to extract information using techniques that left permanent physical damage. During these interrogations died several enslaved people, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation. Nothing useful was revealed by the survivors because they genuinely had nothing to reveal. Whatever was happening, the enslaved population was as ignorant of the details as Greer himself. However, one interrogation produced an interesting detail. An elderly enslaved man named Caesar, who had worked on the plantation for 40 years and whose age had reduced him to light duties, mentioned that he had seen Silas near the cypress grove on several occasions. This observation wasn't particularly meaningful. Many enslaved people had reason to be near the grove for various work-related purposes. But when pressed, Caesar admitted that he had seen Silas entering the grove after dark during the hours when all enslaved people were supposed to be confined to their quarters. Immediately ordered Silas brought to the main house for interrogation did Greer. The guard who went to fetch him found Silas in his assigned sleeping area in the quarters, lying on the rough wooden platform that served as his bed. When they bound his hands and led him across the plantation grounds, he offered no resistance. His pale skin showed fresh bruises and healing wounds from recent beatings, and his eyes watered constantly in the afternoon sunlight, but his expression remained neutral, almost serene. In a storage shed adjacent to the main house, a location Greer preferred for such activities because it was far enough from the slave quarters that screams wouldn't be overheard, took place the interrogation. Present was Calhoun along with Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the two remaining overseers who had arrived from South Carolina. Stripped to the waist and chained to a post in the center of the shed was Silas. His arms were pulled above his head in a position designed to cause maximum discomfort. With questions delivered in a deceptively calm voice began Greer. "You've been seen entering the cypress grove at night. Why?" Remain silent did Silas, his eyes focused on something beyond Greer's shoulder. 5 overseers have disappeared from this plantation in less than 4 months, Greer continued. You arrived here shortly before the first disappearance. That's an interesting coincidence. Still silence. To Dodd nodded Greer, who stepped forward with a leather whip. Systematic and brutal was the beating that followed, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing immediately life-threatening injuries. Experience with such work did Dodd have, and he understood how to pace the punishment to avoid killing the subject too quickly. Torn open was Silas's back, blood running down his pale skin in stark red streams. No sound did he make. His eyes never left the distant point he had fixed upon, and his body remained still except for the involuntary jerks caused by the whip's impact. After 20 lashes, stopped the beating did Greer and tried questions again. Remained absolute did Silas's silence. They resumed the whipping, delivering another 20 lashes that left Silas's back a raw mass of torn flesh. Still, he made no sound. Began to feel uncomfortable did the men in the shed. There was something deeply unsettling about someone who could endure such punishment without crying out, without begging, without showing any sign that the pain affected him at all. He's not human, Fletcher muttered. No man can take that without making a sound. Frustrated and increasingly unnerved, tried a different approach did Greer. He had Silas taken down from the post and secured in a sitting position. Then he ordered hot coals brought from the kitchen fires. Involved pressing heated metal against Silas's skin was the torture that followed, targeting areas that would produce intense pain without causing immediately fatal injuries. The smell of burning flesh filled the shed. More heavily did Silas's pale eyes water, but whether from pain or simply from the smoke was impossible to determine. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He barely moved. After 2 hours of this, even Calhoun, who had limited stomach for the realities of slavery, couldn't watch anymore and left the shed. For another hour continued Greer, Dodd, and Fletcher before finally stopping. Not because they had gotten information, but because they were physically exhausted and psychologically disturbed by Silas's complete lack of response. Dragged back to the slave quarters did they have him, unconscious from blood loss and trauma, but somehow still alive. That night, April 22nd, disappeared two more overseers. Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the men who had participated in Silas's torture, were both assigned to guard duty at the main house. They were armed with rifles and positioned on opposite sides of the building with instructions to call out to each other every 15 minutes to confirm they were alert and present. At midnight, called out Dodd. Fletcher responded. At 12:15, called out Dodd again. No response came from Fletcher. Immediately raised the alarm did Dodd, and within minutes, Greer and the remaining guards were searching the area. They found Fletcher's rifle leaning against the wall of the main house, exactly where he had been standing. His hat lay on the ground nearby. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Simply vanished had Fletcher. Across the plantation grounds found out the searchers, calling Fletcher's name and searching every building and area they could access in the darkness. 2 hours later, when they returned to the main house to regroup and plan a more systematic dawn search, they discovered that Raymond Dodd was also gone. At his post remained his rifle. His position showed no signs of disturbance. From the Calhoun plantation in less than 4 months had now disappeared 7 white men. On April 23rd revealed dawn a plantation descending into chaos. In the main house gathered the remaining white men, Thomas Greer, Jeremiah Calhoun, his secretary, and the 2 hired guards, and barricaded themselves inside. They were outnumbered by the enslaved population 200 to 5, and the careful system of surveillance and control that had maintained order had completely collapsed. In Greer's experience was the situation unprecedented. Occasionally happened individual slave rebellions. Common were escape attempts. On rare occasions occurred even murders of overseers. But something else entirely was this systematic elimination of authority figures. Cautiously emerged the enslaved population from their quarters, uncertain what the new day would bring. Didn't resume the normal routine of forced labor because there was no one to enforce it. During the night had the guards at the quarters abandoned their posts, retreating to the relative safety of the main house. For the first time in memory, experienced a morning without someone telling them what to do did the enslaved people of the Calhoun plantation. Among the first to realize that Silas was missing was Delilah, the cook. Empty was his sleeping area in the quarters. The rough blanket that had covered him was soaked with blood from his torture wounds, but without any sign of the man himself. During the night had several people checked on him, concerned that he might die from his injuries. As recently as 4 hours before dawn, someone had seen him lying there, barely conscious but breathing. Now he was gone. Among the enslaved population sparked intense debate the disappearance of Silas. Some argued that he had finally died from his injuries and that someone had secretly removed the body to avoid questions. Others believed he had somehow recovered enough to walk away, perhaps fleeing into the swamps to escape further torture. Something else entirely was believed by a smaller group, mostly older people who had lived through decades of slavery and had developed a deep skepticism about coincidence. They believed that Silas had been the one responsible for the overseer's disappearances and that his removal from the quarters meant the nightmare was entering its final phase. Inside the main house, debated their options did Greer and Calhoun. Immediately abandon the plantation wanted Calhoun, returning to Savannah and sending federal troops to restore order. That abandoning the property would result in the total loss of Calhoun's human chattel was argued by Greer. The enslaved people would scatter into the swamps and forests, heading for free territory or simply disappearing into Georgia's backcountry where they might survive as fugitives for years. An investment of over $100,000 represented the enslaved population, a fortune that Calhoun couldn't afford to lose. Was to send the secretary and 1 guard to Savannah with urgent messages for both federal authorities and neighboring planters requesting immediate military intervention and assistance. The compromise they reached. Late in the morning left the secretary, riding hard for Savannah with a letter from Calhoun describing the situation in carefully edited terms. He mentioned that several overseers had disappeared under mysterious circumstances but omitted the more disturbing details that might suggest a complete loss of control. That afternoon, while the secretary was still miles from Savannah, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, did Greer. He decided to address the enslaved population directly, using a combination of threats and promises to try to restore some semblance of order. Into the air had the remaining guard fire several rifle shots to gather the enslaved people to the area in front of the main house. When they had assembled, a crowd of over 200 people, some curious, others fearful, all uncertain about what was happening, emerged onto the front porch of the main house, did Greer, and spoke to them. "I know someone here knows what's been happening," Greer began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "7 white men have disappeared from this plantation. That can't happen without someone knowing something. I'm offering freedom, legal, documented freedom, to anyone who provides information leading to whoever is responsible. You'll be given papers and transportation to wherever you want to go. No tricks, no lies. Real freedom." Remained silent the crowd. Continued Greer, shifting from offer to threat. "If no one comes forward, I'll burn these quarters to the ground with everyone in them. I'll see every last one of you dead before I let this plantation fall. You have until sundown to make your choice." Likely empty was the threat. Greer couldn't kill 200 people without bringing down exactly the kind of official scrutiny that Calhoun was trying to avoid. But the enslaved population had no way of knowing that. Back to their quarters dispersed they, gathering in small groups to discuss what to do. That no one knew anything useful was the general consensus. To himself had kept Silas, revealing nothing of his intentions, if indeed he had been responsible for anything. Without witnesses or evidence had the disappearances occurred. There was nothing to tell, even if someone had wanted to claim the offered freedom. As afternoon faded toward evening, approached the main house a young enslaved man named Caleb. Caleb was 16 years old, quick-minded and desperate to escape slavery by any means available. He claimed to have information about the disappearances and requested permission to speak with Greer privately. Hopeful that his threat had worked, agreed the overseer. Into the main house was brought Caleb and led to the room where Greer, Calhoun, and the remaining guard had established their command center. "I seen something," Caleb said, his eyes downcast in the submissive posture that enslaved people learned early. "I seen the pale one, Silas, going into the cypress grove at night multiple times, and I seen him carrying things." "What kinds of things?" Greer demanded. "Couldn't tell for certain in the dark, sir," Caleb replied, "but they looked like bundles, heavy bundles that he carried over his shoulder. He was heading deep into the swamp where the ground gets too wet for most folks to go." With what Caesar had reported earlier about Silas entering the grove aligned this information. Felt a surge of vindication did Greer. His instinct about Silas had been correct. Somehow responsible for the disappearances was the albino slave, though the mechanism remained unclear. How could one man subjected to constant surveillance and regular beatings manage to abduct and kill 7 armed overseers without leaving evidence? "Can you lead us to where he went?" Greer asked Caleb. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied. "I can show you the path he took, but we'd need to go before full dark. Once night comes, that swamp ain't safe for nobody who don't know it proper." Carefully considered this did Greer. The sun was already low on the horizon, giving them perhaps an hour of usable daylight. Going into the cypress grove with limited visibility was dangerous, but waiting until morning meant another night of vulnerability. Quickly made his decision he. "We go now, all of us." He turned to Calhoun. "You'll stay here with the doors barred. If we're not back by dawn, ride for Savannah yourself." Prepared for the expedition did Greer, the remaining guard, a man named Patterson, and Caleb. They armed themselves with rifles, knives, and a length of rope. Also brought a torch did Greer, though he hoped they wouldn't need it before returning. As they left the main house, watched from the quarters dozens of enslaved people, their faces unreadable in the fading light. Toward the cypress grove led them Caleb, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew the terrain. Barely visible was the path he followed, a slight depression in the ground that wound between massive cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. With moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation grew the air thick. In pools began appearing water, then as a continuous shallow layer covering the ground. They were entering the deep swamp. How much farther? Greer asked after they'd walked for nearly 20 minutes. Not far now, sir, Caleb replied. There's a clearing up ahead, maybe 200 yards more. Rapidly was failing the light. Investigate the clearing and then return immediately rather than risk being caught in the swamp after dark, decided Greer they would. They pressed forward, their boots squelching in the muddy water. Through the grove echoed strange sounds, bird calls, the splash of something moving through water, the creak of tree branches swaying in wind they couldn't feel down at ground level. Larger than Greer expected was the clearing when they reached it. It was a roughly circular area, perhaps 50 feet across, where the cypress trees gave way to open space. Slightly elevated here was the ground, creating a dry island in the surrounding wetland, and in the center of this clearing stood a structure that made all three men stop in their tracks. From cypress branches lashed together with what appeared to be strips of leather was it a framework built. The structure stood about 8 feet tall and formed a rough rectangular shape. From this framework were hanging 9 objects that Greer's mind initially refused to identify. Slightly in the breeze did they sway, and as he forced himself to look more carefully, came understanding with a wave of nausea. They were skins. Human skins, stretched and cured like leather hides, still showing the recognizable features of faces, the texture of body hair, the shape of hands and feet. 9 complete human skins, carefully preserved and displayed like trophies. By a distinctive scar on his left arm recognized Greer Wade Parsons. Clearly visible on one of the suspended skins was Robert Finch's tattoo, an anchor he'd gotten during a brief stint in the Merchant Marine. Harder to identify individually were the others, but perfectly matched the count. 9 overseers, all of them here. Immediately vomited Patterson, the sound loud in the grove's unnatural silence. Frozen stood Caleb, his eyes wide with horror. Felt his hand shaking did Greer as he raised his rifle, scanning the clearing for any sign of threat. Far worse than murder was this. This was something that reached beyond the normal bounds of human violence into territory that seemed almost inhuman in its calculated cruelty. "We need to leave," Patterson gasped, wiping his mouth. "We need to get out of here right now." Before Greer could respond, spoke Caleb in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's here. He's been here the whole time." Around spun Greer, following Caleb's gaze. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light, stood Silas. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the gathering darkness. He was shirtless, his back still showing the raw wounds from yesterday's torture, but he stood upright with no sign of pain or weakness. In his right hand held he a long knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. "Put down the knife and surrender," Greer commanded, raising his rifle. "It's over." Didn't move or speak did Silas. He simply stood there, watching them with those pale, watery eyes. As well raised his rifle Patterson, and for a moment the 3 armed men faced the single enslaved man across the clearing. Entirely with Greer's group should have been the advantage. 3 against 1, rifles against a knife. Silas wounded and presumably weakened. But Wrong felt something in the moment. A primal survival instinct, warning him that the situation wasn't what it appeared. First broke Caleb. He turned and ran, splashing back along the path they'd taken into the grove. Shouted after him did Patterson, but didn't follow. Trained on Silas kept Greer his rifle, who still hadn't moved. "I asked you questions yesterday," Greer said, his voice shaking slightly. "You didn't answer then. Answer now. Why did you kill them?" For the first time since arriving at the Calhoun plantation, spoke Silas. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, with an accent that suggested education unusual for an enslaved person. "You already know why. You've always known." "That's not an answer," Greer said. "The only answer is it," Silas said. "They did what you do. They took what wasn't theirs. They hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. They thought being white and armed made them untouchable." Paused Silas, tilting his head slightly. "They were wrong." His rifle fired Patterson. Panicked and poorly aimed was the shot, the bullet striking a tree several feet to Silas's left. Before Patterson could reload, moved Silas. Shocking was the speed of his movement. One moment standing still at the clearing's edge, the next closing the distance to Patterson in a blur of pale skin and flashing steel. With surgical precision found the knife Patterson's throat. Fell the guard, blood pumping from the severed artery, dead before he hit the ground. His rifle fired Greer, but already moved again had Silas, circling around the framework of hanging skins. Nothing but air hit the bullet. For another shot tried Greer to track him, but in the failing light and the confused shadows cast by the suspended skins, seemed to disappear and reappear at random did Silas. The rifle abandoned Greer and drew his pistol, backing toward the path that led out of the clearing. "You can't escape," Silas said, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Mine is this grove. Every path, every sinkhole, every hiding place I know. Already dead are you. You just haven't stopped moving yet." Ran Greer. He crashed through the undergrowth, following what he hoped was the path back to the plantation. Behind him could he hear splashing footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always there. Nearly complete now was the darkness, and repeatedly stumbled he over roots and through hidden pools of water. His lungs burned and his heart hammered in his chest. His face did branches whip and tear at his clothes. Lost was he realized. The path had disappeared in the darkness, or he'd strayed from it in his panic. By cypress trees and black water was he surrounded with no clear sense of direction. Stopped he, trying to quiet his breathing enough to listen for pursuit. Except for the normal sounds of the swamp at night was silent the grove. Then felt he something touch his shoulder, just a light pressure, almost gentle. Around spun he and saw Silas standing directly behind him, close enough that Greer could see the details of his wounds in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Please," whispered Greer, all his authority and cruelty stripped away, leaving only naked fear. "Please don't." "Did they say please?" Silas's pale eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. "The people you beat, the women you violated, the children you sold away from their mothers. Did you stop when they begged?" His pistol tried Greer to raise, but his hand wouldn't obey him. Terror had locked his muscles, and he could only stand there as Silas reached forward with the knife. The last thing Thomas Greer saw was his own reflection in those colorless eyes. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, intensifies the horror in Burke County. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Together let's discover what happens next. From the cypress grove in full panic burst Caleb, running toward the main house where Jeremiah Calhoun waited. With the doors barred, pounded he on the entrance, screaming to be let in. Hearing the genuine terror in the young man's voice, unbarred the door just long enough for Caleb to tumble inside before slamming and securing it again did Calhoun. "What happened?" Calhoun demanded. "Where's Greer? Where's Patterson?" Hyperventilating was Caleb, barely able to form words. When he finally managed to speak, made Calhoun's blood run cold. The story he told, the clearing, the framework, the skins, the appearance of Silas, and the killing of Patterson before Caleb fled. What had happened to Greer didn't he know, but assumed the overseer was dead as well. A terrible calculus faced Calhoun. Still hours away was dawn. Until mid-morning at earliest wouldn't reach the city the secretary he'd sent to Savannah, and even then it would take time to organize any kind of rescue party. Alone in this house was he with a 16-year-old enslaved boy, surrounded by 200 enslaved people who had every reason to hate him. And somewhere in the darkness outside was a man who had killed 10 white men with apparent ease. The longest of Jeremiah Calhoun's life was the night that followed. In the main room sat he with a rifle across his lap, starting at every sound. In a corner huddled Caleb, occasionally whimpering. The house creaked and settled. Outside, amplified and threatening seemed the normal sounds of the plantation at night, dogs barking in the distance, wind moving through trees, the call of night birds. Around midnight, scratched at the front door something. Just a light sound like fingernails drawn across wood. For several minutes continued it, then stopped. An hour later, came again it, this time at a window. Through the gap in the shutters peered Calhoun, but nothing in the darkness outside saw he. Stopped the scratching. Returned silence. Near dawn, heard Calhoun voices. Belonging to enslaved people from the quarters recognized he them, multiple individuals engaged in what sounded like excited conversation. Another look through the shutters risked he and saw figures moving in the growing light. People gathering near the path that led to the cypress grove. Celebrating something seemed they, though he couldn't make out the details of their conversation. When full dawn arrived, finally worked up the courage to open the door did Calhoun. In the open area between the main house and the quarters had assembled the enslaved population, every man, woman, and child on the plantation. In a loose semicircle stood they, all facing the cypress grove path. As Calhoun emerged onto the porch, turned to look at him did they. Vary their expressions, some showed fear, others satisfaction. Many displayed simple curiosity about what would happen next. From the path emerged Silas. Slowly walked he, still shirtless, his wounded back visible to everyone. Something in his arms carried he, a bundle wrapped in cloth that he handled carefully. To let him through parted the crowd, maintaining a respectful distance but showing no signs of aggression toward him. To a point about 20 feet from the main house walked he, and stopped. "Mr. Calhoun," called out Silas, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Something I brought you." Unwrapped he the bundle, revealing Thomas Greer's head. In an expression of absolute terror was frozen the overseer's face, eyes wide and mouth open as if in mid-scream. Carefully on the ground placed it Silas, then straightened and looked directly at Calhoun. "On fear operated this plantation," Silas said. "Fear you used to control us, to break us, to make us forget we were human. Now understand you what real fear feels like. The same lesson learned every man who tortured us, who violated our women, who separated our families. A weapon is fear, but it can be turned around." With shaking hands raised his rifle Calhoun, pointing it at Silas. Uneasily stirred the enslaved population, some moving forward as if to protect Silas, others backing away from the potential violence. No move to defend himself or retreat made Silas. "Me you can shoot," said Silas calmly. "What's happened won't change it. Your overseer's back won't it bring. Your control won't it restore. Finished is this plantation, Mr. Calhoun. You just haven't accepted it yet." For a long moment, stood frozen Calhoun with the rifle aimed at Silas's chest. On the trigger rested his finger. One squeeze and the nightmare would end. Or at least the man who represented the nightmare would end. But as he looked at the assembled enslaved people, realized Calhoun the truth of Silas's words. Even if he killed Silas, one man facing 200 was he. Beyond repair was shattered the illusion of control that had maintained the plantation system. Lowered the rifle he. Slowly nodded Silas, as if this was the response he'd expected. Turned and walked back toward the cypress grove did he. Watched him go did the enslaved population, then slowly began to disperse, returning to the quarters or moving toward the areas where they usually worked. But didn't resume the work. Without overseers to enforce it, without the systematic violence that had structured every hour of plantation life, simply stopped functioning had the entire social order. That afternoon returned Jeremiah Calhoun's secretary with a detachment of 20 soldiers from the federal garrison in Savannah, along with the county sheriff and a judge. A plantation in a state of limbo was what they found. On the property remained the enslaved population but performed no work. On the porch of the main house sat Calhoun, rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. When questioned about the situation, told a carefully edited version of events did he, 10 overseers had disappeared or been killed, the perpetrator was an enslaved man who had since fled into the swamps, and the plantation required federal intervention to restore order. A search of the plantation, including the cypress grove, was conducted by the soldiers. Found they the clearing with its gruesome framework of preserved human skins exactly as Caleb had described. Found they Patterson's body near the clearing and Greer's headless corpse deeper in the swamp. Never recovered were the other bodies. Burned were the skins removed, and abandoned was the clearing. For Silas was organized a manhunt with slave patrols and military units combing Burke County and the surrounding areas. No trace of him found they. As if he had dissolved into the swamps like morning mist was it. That he died from his torture wound somewhere deep in the wetlands speculated some. That he'd made his way north, joining the thousands of enslaved people who followed the Underground Railroad to freedom believed others. That he was still out there in the cypress groves, watching and waiting whispered a few. Never recovered did the Calhoun plantation. Without overseers willing to take the position, throughout Georgia had spread the news of the disappearances. Despite Calhoun's attempts at secrecy, couldn't operate the property. As a single unit attempted Calhoun to sell the plantation and its enslaved population but found no buyers. Worthless made it the property's reputation. Within a year, individually to other planters had Calhoun sold the enslaved people, dispersing them across the South, and abandoned the land itself. Eventually burned was the main house, whether by accident or arson was never determined. For decades stood empty the slave quarters before finally collapsing. Through the enslaved communities of Georgia and beyond circulated the story of Devil's White, changing with each retelling but maintaining its essential elements. An albino enslaved man, tortured beyond endurance, had hunted and killed 9 white overseers before vanishing into legend. For different audiences served different purposes the story. For enslaved people, it was a story of resistance and revenge, a reminder that even the most brutal system contained the seeds of its own destruction. For white Southerners, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient control, though they rarely admitted this publicly. By a historian researching Burke County records in the 1920s was discovered one detail that was left out of most official accounts. Among the documents related to the Calhoun plantation, found she a bill of sale dated 1853 for the purchase of an enslaved man from Chatham County. That the individual being sold had been trained as a tanner, a person skilled in preserving and preparing animal hides, mentioned the notation on the sale. A disturbing possibility about why Silas possessed the knowledge necessary to preserve human skins with such skill was suggested by this single detail. As the plantation around it was abandoned eventually returned to wilderness did the cypress grove where the clearing stood. Claiming it felt wrong somehow, though they couldn't articulate exactly what they meant, avoided the area local people. In the 1890s, attempted to harvest timber from the Grover Logging Company, but after several men reported seeing a pale figure watching them from between the trees, refused to enter workers. As inaccessible eventually wrote off the grove the company and moved their operations elsewhere. During the Civil War, limited action saw Burke County, but as a temporary camp for both Confederate and Union forces at different times served the abandoned Calhoun plantation. Strange occurrences in the area reported soldiers from both armies, unexplained sounds from the cypress grove, the sensation of being watched, equipment going missing and then reappearing in unusual locations. That his men refused to patrol near the grove after dark, claiming they could hear screaming coming from deep within the swamp, noted one Union officer in his diary. As part of various historical documentation projects were interviewed in the decades following emancipation some of the formerly enslaved people from the Calhoun plantation. Remarkably consistent in the basic facts were their accounts of the events of 1853 to 1854, but wildly varied in their interpretation of what Silas had been. As a man driven to justified violence by unbearable cruelty described him some. In almost mythological terms spoke others of him, as if he had been something more than human, a force of retribution given physical form. Simply stated one elderly woman interviewed in 1903, Devil's White wasn't no devil. He was what we needed him to be. He was our answer when we couldn't find no other answer. Unknown remains the true fate of Silas. No clear matches for an albino escaped slave arriving during 1854 contain records from northern states, though the Underground Railroad deliberately left minimal documentation. That he died from his injuries shortly after leaving the plantation, his body lost in the vast swamps of southeastern Georgia have speculated some researchers. To occasional reports from subsequent decades point others, rumors of a pale man seen in swamplands across the South, always appearing in areas where plantation cruelty was particularly severe, always vanishing before authorities could investigate. This mystery shows us how the most brutal systems can give rise to equally brutal resistance, and how terror, once unleashed, recognizes no boundaries. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Silas survived, or did he disappear into the swamps forever? Was he justified in his actions, or did his revenge cross lines that should never be crossed regardless of the circumstances? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. More secrets than we can imagine holds the darkness of history, and together we'll continue exploring them. See you in the next video.